Welcome to Practicing Failure, where we learn about mental health, celebrate mistakes, and explore how failure helps us grow. I'm your host, Dr. Amanda Castle, and I'm super excited to introduce my guest today, Dr. Norma Ramírez. Dr. Ramírez is a bicultural, bilingual, undocumented, licensed psychologist in California and Nevada. She's previously served as the clinical director at an immigration nonprofit and is currently growing her private practice. Dr. Ramírez serves diverse populations, including undocumented immigrant communities, first-generation professionals, neurodivergent individuals, and the LGBTQ community. Dr. Ramírez is a fierce advocate for immigrant and minoritized communities, as evidenced by her role as a plaintiff against the Trump administration for illegally rescinding DACA in 2017. She was later recognized as a Latinx leader by the Biden and Harris administration for all of her advocacy work. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Ramírez.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
So there are a lot of topics that we could get into because you have a really deep breadth of experience that is hyper-specialized. And I think not a lot of people have the experience that you have. And one of the things you and I have talked about from different perspectives is how practicing failure is both really helpful for learning and growing, but how, for many different reasons, some people are thrust into these situations out of survival more than out of a place of intentionally wanting to grow. And so I'm hoping today we can kind of talk about this balance of grief that comes from that unfair and unjust reality of life, with also the gratitude that, these hardships also do help us grow. And so we have to hold that grief and gratitude together in fairly complicated ways.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking in terms of even the idea of balance, right? Like we have gotten so used to saying we have to have a balance with this and that. I personally don't know if there is a balance. I wouldn't know even how to quantify or take that into account.
That's fair. And I think acknowledging the existence of both does not always feel balanced and even. Mm-hmm. But they're both there.
Yeah. But I get what you mean.
And I get what you're saying. And that's, I think, part of the challenge just in general of working in mental health is we have to hold all of these complex, seemingly disparate things together and try to make sense of it when it feels untenable.
Yeah.
So before we get into practicing failure more specifically, I want to learn more kind of about the work that you do and the populations you serve, because they're pretty varied, mm-hmm. but they do all center around this theme of minoritized identities. And so what are some of the topics that maybe are shared between these groups and that you see a lot in your work?
I mean, I think there's definitely a sense of, in some ways, like growing up too fast in some ways, or having like very isolated experiences at the time, like not knowing, that other people were going through the same thing that they were going through. And maybe even now, because of some of how their, the intersectionalities or the intersectionality of their identities, is still something that can feel very isolating and then having to figure out how to navigate that, right? That there's maybe not that many people in that same situation. I mean, I think first it comes from the sense of like, I can't be wrong. Like I can't make a mistake. And so that can look differently depending on which population we're talking about. So like if it's with the undocumented population, it's like, if even like tardiness, right? Or like not going to school, like what kind of impact is that going to have? Because you then get like the wellness checks, or maybe not wellness checks, but like having, someone from school on then these other things. And so, or don't even something as like, don't spend time with the wrong people, right? Because while maybe they might just get like a slap on the wrist, like for you, it might be different. Right. So that's for the undocumented population. For like maybe other individuals, like it's that sense of like, I can't make a mistake because then something really terrible is going to happen. And so it's trying to mitigate those consequences, which when you think about it, there's truth to it, right? But there's also a lot that is out of our control and that we may be trying to like mitigate, but it really doesn't necessarily have a direct impact whether this or that happens. But as children, we don't know that, you know? And so...
Yeah, because these are all identities that people grow up with.
Mm-hmm.
And so they shape how your brain develops.
Mm-hmm. I think even to make it even more, in some ways, general but specific, in the sense that, like, say there's a parent who maybe is really stressed out by whatever is going on in their lives, but you as a child, you don't know whatever it is that they're stressed about. And you're like, oh, well, maybe if I, like, start cleaning my room, my mom will not be mad or not get angry, right? And so I do that once, and it's like, oh, I noticed that worked. It seemed like they're in a better mood, which is like a relief, right, for you as a child. But maybe next time you clean your room and nothing happens, like your mom is still upset. And so it's very confusing because then you don't have any real sense of control, or not control, but like what to expect. Expectations of like, if I do this, then there's this consequence. And if I do that, then there's this other consequence. We like to call them logical consequences.
You can't find a consistent. There's no like template that you can build.
Right.
Yeah.
And so as we grow up and we don't have a good measurement of like what will bring about what kind of consequence, sometimes this anxiety is because we're trying to do all the things we can do to try to mitigate that.
So then excellence becomes a way of sort of regulating your environment so that it's less overwhelming.
Yeah. Typically, that's what I've noticed. It is very outside, right? Because, and there's a disconnect that, like, it doesn't matter how excellent you might be, you still yourself, like, you don't feel good enough. You feel like you're still failing because it is external, right? Because, like, I mean, I think we can look at just about any community right now with what's happening with the country, and, like, all of these things are outside of our direct control. Like, can we do things? Yes. But like a direct, like, I'm going to go and do this right now, like, that's not there.
Yeah. And so we're left holding all of this stress and feeling powerless at the same time.
Right. And it's a cycle because then you're like, oh, well, let me then try to do something about this. And so you then, again, try to exert some kind of control over your environment. Which then can lead into like other things, right? Of like the anxiety itself could feel really overwhelming. And so like people end up freezing, right? There's like all these physical health outcomes that come with that, right? Chronic conditions, all of these things. And our relationships and how we relate to others and whether I can trust, you know, this person that I just met at Starbucks or a different coffee place, right? Wherever we go. And yeah, like it's something that does impact the way that we relate to ourselves and to others and like our environment.
Yeah. And then for a number of these minoritized groups, there's also this push to excel in the sense of like survival. Don't want to get caught in a situation that I could have avoided. Then there's also an attempt to kind of regulate the stress of the environment. But then there's also, no matter how much you excel, the system is still there. The pressures are still there. Mm-hmm. And so that threshold of feeling good enough, it doesn't really ever come, does it?
Not really. Not on its own. Like the environment isn't going to give that to you. Like, and it can feel really unfair to be like, on top of that, I have to do my own work. Like, I have to be the one that gets me out of this. And sadly, yes, like, because the environment isn't going to give it to you. No one else is going to give it to you because the majority of people are trapped in some kind of thing with, or maybe not trapped, but they're in their own stuff. And yeah, like, you know, we have to recognize the individual factors and individual things that we do and that we have agency over and responsibility. And again, also recognize the interpersonal, the relational, and the systemic stuff. Like, all of that has its own weight. And it doesn't take away from the fact that we have to do our own work.
Yeah, and I think you describing that really shows the black and white thinking will never sufficiently give us an answer. No. The answers are all in this gray area that are different from individual to individual.
Yeah, it is. And, you know, and just as like a caveat, like, I don't think that there's like maybe there's no like specific right or wrong answer for like everybody, but I do think that there are values that we can, that are, I would say, probably better than some others. And so having those as a guide will help us get to like what that would look like for a specific person or group or community.
So if you can kind of anchor into the values and have that as a guiding force rather than maybe an external metric set up by another person, another group, or another system, that shifts how you engage it.
Yeah. I mean, I hadn't actually thought about it that way, at least explicitly.
That's what I just heard from you.
Yeah. Explicitly. Yeah, I had to make my own connection.
Yeah.
But yeah. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I think you summarized it really well.
All right. So in that vein, you know, we as therapists, but also just people in general, what you're describing is true of minoritized groups, but those truths do hang true for even majority groups as well. There are these external forces that we can influence but don't fully control. There's ways that we contribute as individuals, and there's an intersection of all of that we then have to piece out what's mine to hold and where can I push back and what do I not want to pick up, all of that. But when we see it in minority communities, when it's a little more pronounced and we see the suffering more clearly, a lot of us have this pull to want to praise the ability to survive. Oh, this was so hard, but look how good you did. That's so impressive. And it's true. Like, what you've done with your life, what you have built, the accomplishments you've made are profoundly impressive. So it's not a bad instinct to want to praise that, but it can erase key portions of lived experience and sort of how complicated and nuanced the process is. Do you have any guidance for people on how we can acknowledge those strengths without minimizing what people go through?
I think, you know, we tend to go to, oh, you're amazing, and but you're doing so well, or yeah, trying to, I guess, praise the outcome, like the outcome of whatever it is that the person is talking about. I think some of that comes from our own uncomfortableness, like that we don't know what to say. And particularly when it's an experience that we don't know, or maybe, you know, someone is sharing something and we've never experienced something like that. And it can be difficult to try to empathize of like, oh, okay, what could that feel like? Or even recognizing like, I might not even know what that feels like, even though I'm trying to imagine it. And so I think it's recognizing that. It's recognizing that like, hey, maybe I feel uncomfortable and I don't know what to do with the life experience that my friend just shared with me or that I just heard. And I think, you know, it does call for self-reflection in those times of maybe I need to sit with this a little bit longer before I say something. Because then I think the response that we give isn't necessarily to alleviate some kind of difficult emotion or pain from the other person, but it's to alleviate our own uncomfortableness. So that's what I would say first, of just take a moment, you know, and sometimes honestly, it's better if you don't say anything than to say something, you know. Mm-hmm. And I think depending on the relationship that you have with the person, then you could, you know, be more open, I think, of that reflexibility. I find that people who are experiencing these, the cumulative effects of the minoritized identities, tend to appreciate when someone's willing to listen, when someone's like willing to be like, hey, I actually don't really know what that's like. Like, what does that look like? Or, have some curiosity about them. And from that, like this genuine wanting to know. Because I think some people also can sort of twist that a little bit. But I think that just opens up things for, a conversation. And on the other side too, or another dimension of that is that it's not a hierarchical type of relationship, right? Like just because someone has experienced maybe more hardships or hardships that you don't understand that maybe seem maybe worse. And some of them can be, right? Like they legitimately can be worse than what you've experienced. Like that doesn't mean that you are somehow better than, or like there's this dynamic that gets created like, oh, like I'm so sorry. Like I can't share about my struggles because they just don't compare to yours. And so, so let's just talk about you and I'm just here to help you. But there's no reciprocity there. So being mindful of that, of like, hey, you can ask questions, be there. But also like if the other person is intended to and has the capacity to be like, hey, how are you doing? That also is a part of it.
That's treating it more as a full relationship rather than this sort of poor person that just needs my help right now. Mm-hmm. But that is a difficult dynamic to find, because I think if we jump too quickly into, right, here's my problem, then it's like, well, we haven't given it the gravity that it deserves. But if we only acknowledge one side of problems, then it starts to feel like, well, in this relationship, I'm always the problem and I don't really want to feel that way. So maybe I don't want to open up anymore. Mm-hmm. And so you're right. There's this reciprocity that can be uneven at times, which that's appropriate, but moving toward a place of ebb and flow back and forth.
Yeah. And the context matters, right? So like if we're not in like a town hall community meeting where we're trying to solve problems, obviously the focus is going to be on solving whatever problem, right? But if you're talking about relationships and this is your friend, then like, yeah, absolutely. Like there needs to be some kind of reciprocity, right? And there could be a myriad of reasons as to why that's not happening, right? Both individual and also like interpersonal dynamics. But we lose sight of how we get focused on so much on like, well, I can't give them papers, right? I can't say like solve their legal status,
right? But
research has shown that like literally having good relationships prolongs your life, and it's actually very sustainable and life-giving. And part of a good relationship is one, having people that are really good at listening to you and seeing you as a person, but also the reciprocity of like, hey, this is also my person, right? Like, and that it's not about solving the problem. It's about facing the problem together. And mm-hmm. I would even say problems, because it's not just one person, right? It's both. So that's what that's about.
I really like how you framed that. And I think it pulls back in of people are whole and complex, and we should be interacting with them as such. But it's very easy to kind of other and group and try to simplify in a way that removes humanity from people so quickly. Yeah. But I think some of the things that you talked about, like dealing with our own discomfort so that we can honestly show up for other people and sit in spaces of not knowing, not having easy solutions, not having comfortable, nice emotions, or I guess easy emotions would be a better way to say that. It gets into some of our worldviews, right? Because some of us spiritually or just worldview-wise, there's this underlying assumption that if we are living morally, life should be easy. Mm. And so if your life is hard, maybe you're not doing it right. And this judgment can seep in, even unintentionally, through just how we respond to hardship.
Well, I mean, so this is where we go into like looking at our society, right? Like Obviously, there's colonization and like neocolonialism and capitalism and how even our spiritual religious beliefs are so entrenched and intertwined with these colonizing kind of mechanisms in our world. And so, right, like with capitalism, it's like, well, if you're poor because you want to be, because you didn't work hard enough, because you were giving all of these opportunities and look, you haven't done anything with your life. Like that's what capitalism says, and this colonizing kind of mindset, right? And if we look into our religious beliefs, like there's so much theology on, well, if you were a good person, then good things would happen to you, or similarly to like very merit-based, like if you just did the right thing, then your life would be better.
God's going to reward you.
Yeah, God's going to reward you. And on the other side of that, it's like, well, if your life isn't going well, that's because you've sinned. There's some kind of you haven't repented of something, or you haven't done something to absolve you from these hardships. And I think some of that is like a way for us to cope with the fact that we actually can't, that morality isn't tied to success and to a good life. In some ways it's the flip side, because when you look at like billionaires and stuff like that, like in order for them to be billionaires, their kind of morality, I would say, it's kind of twisted, right? Because you could be solving so many issues in the world, and you're choosing not to. So what kind of morality is that? And I mean, it's a weird thing that we've bought into as a society, to be like, well, this is what's morally correct, and if I'm moral, then this is going to happen. And in some ways that ends up making it so that we ourselves impose these beliefs and impose these negative consequences on other people for not measuring up to whatever we think they should be measuring up to, while these other people are just like happy, just doing their own thing.
Yeah. And it could also be a way to comfort ourselves around maybe privileges we didn't earn, that just we were born into. And that narrative makes it so that I don't have to think about this unfairness and injustice. And I'm not successful because of these demographics I was born into, but because I worked really hard. And if they worked hard, they could have the same success. So, and look, there's actually an example of somebody who worked really hard and did it. So then everybody should theoretically be possible.
Right.
And now it's an individual failing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, maybe that's where we can come in as psychologists, but like, I think there's these intrapsychic processes, right, of like projecting and objectifying people, and externalizing and splitting off our bad parts, the things that we don't like about ourselves, onto other people who we can dehumanize more easily. So we definitely do that. Yeah. So
that would look like I'm moral and good, and those people are evil and bad.
That would be one way that it could look like, yeah. Or even just what you were talking about, like, well, I suffered, and now look at where I'm at, so why should I help someone else, even? Something like that,
Yeah. And even looking at kind of the state of how things are in the world, well, if I help one person, everyone's going to expect help, and I can't do it. So I'm just going to kind of put my blinders on and live the best, most comfortable life I can for myself.
Yeah. And there's so many things that fall into it, right? Because like, there's so many people already that I've talked about how like even buying a home, right? It's so different just 20 years ago. And if we keep going back, right? Like it was a much easier time to access and to have the resources to buy a home than it is now, right? And so even to have some awareness of things change, and I can't use my reference point as the current reference point. Like, we struggle with that for some reason. We struggle with like, oh, people have a different experience than the one I have. Just starting off there, I don't know. We struggle with that.
So many of us, it feels like if I acknowledge that you're having this hard time, and maybe even it was harder than mine, then my experience gets erased. And so then I have to come in even harder with how bad my experience was to prove that I also suffered.
Yeah. Yeah, we get into weird games. And it's unhelpful. And also, I don't know, because then that goes into like, well, your experience isn't being erased. It's just not the one that right now is the most relevant in the conversation right now. And what does that look like? Like, I don't know. I think that if you have your home and you're fine and whatever, like, what is there to complain about, in terms of that, right? So, like, it's weird. Like, I feel like it imposes some kind of threat, which I guess you described about having their experience erased.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I guess people have to find a way of, like, actually doing the work of themselves to be comfortable and confident in their own experience. And I think it goes back to that, again, having those relationships where we are actually navigating our own, the reflections of ourselves that we see that come out in relationships. Sadly, I think we actually don't do that, if at all, with our friends. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think the emotional work of fully seeing each other in our relationships, friendships, family, etc., and then also doing our own work of healing and coming to peace with any unfairness and injustice we face. Because I think an example that comes to mind that's, I think, less emotionally charged for people is grad school. Mm. So if we look at grad school, it just continues to get harder as technology advances, as more research is done, and you have to get more in the weeds with new research and more publications are expected. It continues to just get harder. That does not mean that my grad student experience was easy. It was very hard in specific ways. But I can also, I work with a lot of grad students and I see them like, this is different and this is changing and that's hard. And so we just have to hold these as two different things rather than, like you said, hierarchy ranking of what's better and who's allowed to be sad and who's allowed to be upset. And this just is what it is. And we each come into it with different lived experiences within different contexts. The country is very different for grad students now than it was 6 years ago. And so that comparison doesn't really serve to help us. But if I'm at peace with what I went through and how it was difficult, my goal is not to inflict that suffering on other people so that they understand my experience. That's a kind of misdirected way to try to get empathy, but rather to say, like, this is hard. How do we make it less terrible for people? But that requires a lot of work.
Yeah. And quite honestly, it's still something that I'm trying to, like, figure out, like, what factors make people want to change, like, for the better of, like, not reenacting their pain onto others. Mm-hmm. I don't have a clear answer for that. Yeah, that's all I got.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think one that some like resilience-oriented psychology is trying to kind of answer. But it is like, what are the contextual but also personal factors that lead us to have such different outcomes from hardship? Mm-hmm. And
yeah, I mean, I do know for sure. Well, I don't know about for sure, but my sense is that people who are supported, when they have a time of need, are more likely to also want to help others. It's just the thing, though, that happens in my brain is that I go back to, like, well, what makes someone, notice that? Because then there's people who notice, right? Like, oh, I got a lot of help. But then there's other people who maybe they do get help and they're like, nobody wants to help me. So,
or I did this on my own.
Yeah. And so it's like there's some mechanism. There's some mechanism that makes people or encourages people to notice the contribution of others in their own story, like meaningful contributions, I guess, in their own story, where other people seem to easily discard those instances. So I think there's something underneath that. But I think if you're listening and you're wanting to change some of that you want to, I would say that's a good start, of like actually trying to take in what is happening, like to make space, right? Because sometimes we can get so overwhelmed by everything that's happening, like all the suffering, all the pain, individually on our loved ones. The world that we live in now feels very uncertain than it was even 5 years ago, right? So
even 5 months ago.
Yeah, it's changed a lot. And so to do the work of not dismissing one or the other, because sometimes you're going to like, oh, well, let me just focus on the positive and think positively. I don't believe in that. I do believe in noticing what is actually there. So, maybe you do have friends, at least one other person who cares about you, right? And who's checking in on you, or who you can have a conversation with, or you have children, family, whatever, you have loved ones. You have your dog, you have your plants, whatever it is, right? Like, there are things, like, how can I say this? Sometimes we think that there is a balance of, like, bad stuff that's directly correlated to good stuff or beautiful things. So if the bad goes up, then the beauty, the good stuff has to go down. Mm-hmm. And actually, those are not related at all. All the horrible things happen on their own scale, and all the beautiful, wonderful things also happen on their own scale. And so what I encourage people to do is to make space for both.
Yeah, because if we only focus on all of the good things, that can lead into the toxic positivity. But if we only focus on the bad things, that can take us into despair. Mm-hmm. It makes me think of your private practice is called All the Good Things. And I imagine working with communities that have historically faced a lot of oppression, it is very easy to lose track of the good things.
Yeah. And I mean, the reason why I titled it All Good Things is because I think with the marginalized communities that I work with, we get, socialized into thinking that we don't deserve good things. And so that's just me trying to make a little dent in, like, actually we do deserve all good things, all the good things that we can, because we already have so much of the other stuff, and so that's what I try to do, and that's where it comes from.
Yeah, your existence just by nature of being alive and present means you are deserving of good things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, regardless of where you were born, which none of us have control over, who you were born to, which none of us have control over. There's so much that we cast judgment with over things that none of us had control over in the first place.
Yeah.
Okay, that might be a nice kind of segue into, we've touched on this some, but that concept of practicing failure is not optional.
Mm-hmm.
So the ability to step into something terrifying and figure it out, like if you have a fear of public speaking, and you can sort of intentionally and mindfully step into that until you can tolerate it and continue to grow that skill. But for minoritized groups, that survival necessity is there. So in the populations that you work with, what are some of the ways that people are forced to sort of, quote unquote, face failure out of a place of survival?
I mean, it's constant. I'll give you an example. I have a client who has a child that's been diagnosed with autism. They're undocumented. The child is a U.S. citizen. But even the complexity of, I have to go fight for my child to have access, the access that they are entitled to, that,
mm-hmm. The reasonable accommodations that mm-hmm. the ADA protects.
Right. within a system, within a public school system that doesn't have resources, that has all these reasons as to why they don't want to assess, right? How do you start navigating that? And it is actually constant failure, in the sense of like, I have to keep calling, they're not answering. It turns out I have to fill out these other forms. And then I fill out these forms, but then they tell me that the person that I sent them to, it's not that person, it's this other person. And so it can feel like that's a personal failure on
right, because it's your
right?
job to take care of your child and get access to these things for your child. But it's also a really complicated system to do that.
Right, but it's not about the mom. It's the system. It's the system that is...
Exactly.
Because they're underfunded, under-resourced, under all the things, right? The system itself is trying to navigate this situation in a way so that it's not even further burdened, we could put it that way. But the impact, it's felt as a mother of, I'm not doing right by my son. I'm not taking care of him. So that can feel like failure. Absolutely. But is it a personal failure? No, absolutely not. But when you're in it, though, like, that's the experience that people have. And so there's many situations like that. That's just the one that came up to me right now. But people face that in these other... like it's almost like people get used to it because they happen so often, so daily, of like, yeah, this is just what it's going to look like. And so I just learned how to navigate it and how to hold this tension where on one end I can sort of understand that I'm not necessarily the one failing, but I experienced the rejection, I experienced the hatred, I experienced that I'm supposed to be ashamed or feel guilty for whatever. Like, we still see that coming through. And I guess this is part of what people call, like, it could be, like microaggressions, where now people are like, well, they're not micro, they actually are very significant, right? But like racialized stress, like all these things, like this is where that comes from. Like we feel it.
When it has measurable consequences for mental and physical health over time. Like, the research is continually showing that wears on us to a problematic degree.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that tension that, because it's so embedded in our society, the people that I talk to immediately go to like, I'm just not good enough. Like, I have to find a better way of dealing with this, or it shouldn't be impacting me the way that it's impacting me, or I did something wrong. And so, yeah, I deserved it. And it does take work to be like, wait, hold on, let's examine and let's think about what dynamics are at play. And even though we don't have like a perfect equation to be like, this is individual, this is systemic, this is this, whatever, family, let's just take a look at it though, and just try to get a feel of where this responsibility lies and the impact that it's having. And again, most of the time, individual responsibility falls really low, because we start to see how these different systems in so many different ways touch all the areas of our lives. And it's so powerful. Yeah. And so then the impact is that people feel anxious, powerlessness, a lot of despair. And the interesting that happens though, because some people, I guess if they're listening, they might be like, oh, that's really heavy. Like, I don't know that I want to see that. But you do it well, and you do it with the person, and you're doing it to understand their experience, something happens. Something happens with both of you can sit down and look at it and be like, yeah, that's shitty. And this is why. Something happens where, I don't know, I don't think I have found words to it really well to articulate the experience, but people feel heard, they feel seen, and something sort of gets lifted. And it's like, okay.
I'm not alone,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And we can handle a lot more when we don't feel alone.
Yeah.
It's an interesting contrast, I think, as you're talking about the role of relationships and how that helps us survive, it helps ground us. This kind of American ideal of hyper-individualism,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of like the blame we take on of like, all of this is my fault,
Mm-hmm.
comes from that same lens. And where that can maybe serve to keep some systems functioning in the way that they were designed to, and how sort of more communal cultures might feel threatening to that way of life, but actually are bringing deep richness
Mm-hmm.
into how we might better survive collectively.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, it's intended to function the way that it's intended to, right? And there was this shift in terms of even in the United States of with the Industrial Revolution, like that's when people started to leave their homes, their communities, and they went to have more of these industrial jobs, right, into the city. And it's interesting because there's a correlation when that happened and with the kind of psychology that we know now, because now people needed additional support. They didn't have their communities to rely on, and that actually created a demand for psychology, for therapy. So I think our default, right, and we know this with science, we know this because our brain to body ratio, it's like we have a big brain compared to our body, not because we're intelligent, not because we're smart, but because we need social connection. Like our brain is the size that it is because it requires all of that for all the social pieces that we're trying to do. And so legitimately, like, we're social beings, and our biology, our baseline is to be in relationship, is to be in community. And all this that we're doing, it's taking us away from each other in so many different ways, through shopping, through addictions, right? Whatever kinds of addictions, whether it's going to the gym, because some people are like, oh, well, if you go to the gym, that's not bad. Well, it can be. It can be.
We can do anything to an unhealthy degree.
Yes. And so anything that we use to escape can further separate us from each other. And that is very common here in the U.S. People don't know who their neighbors are. People don't know, like, I mean, I can say this for myself. Like, I can go days without talking to someone else, here. And then I was in Mexico for about a month or so, and like, I saw people all the time. So yeah, there's a very different dynamic that we have created here that's very individualistic and isolating.
Yeah. And I think this goes back to not being in black and white thinking of, it's not like one culture has figured out this perfect solution to everything, but we have things that we can all learn from each other. Mm-hmm. Some things that cultures are doing really well and are promoting health, things that are unique to that culture that maybe highlight things that are less healthy and less useful. And our openness to each other and being in relationships of all kinds gives us so many more outlets and so many more tools to navigate life.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we also fall into that, like you just said, that binary of like, oh, well, collectivist cultures are like really wonderful, and that's the ideal. And so we sort of romanticize, the culture. And it's like, yeah, there's pieces of it that are really wonderful, but there's also some things that, like, they might not be so helpful, And this is where I have trouble with it too, because I'm like, I see this too, like, almost with anyone. So there's a bit of it where I'm like, I don't know how much of it is culture and how much of it is just that we just didn't learn how to handle our own emotions, which is that people some people have the experience of like putting the responsibility for their discomfort onto others.
Yes. Like
people
my kids are supposed to make me feel better.
Yeah. And it plays out differently. Maybe the difference is that it plays out differently with cultures. So on the one hand, you can kind of see it where it's like you don't leave your home until you're married. And while you're there, you're helping out with the home, right? And part of that is because like if you don't have the financial resources and those kinds of things, like you have to be together as a family so that everybody can help support the family. But sometimes along with that, it's like, well, I need to do that. It can generalize to the interpsychic emotional experiences of, oh, I need to take care of like my father's emotions or whatever they do, or my mom's or whatever. And how that gets played into that could be one way. And then in other ways, I've seen it also in like, my children have to fulfill the dreams that I didn't fulfill. Right. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's a difference, but I see that. And so all I was trying to say was that, to reiterate what you were saying of, yeah, we all have things that are great where it's like, yeah, we have community and we can rely on each other, but then also there are all the other things that can happen when we don't have that emotional and psychological awareness of ourselves and our needs, and when they're not being met and all these things.
Which then brings in the importance of like having the ability and the skills to process emotions, to talk more directly about what's going on, so that those can be honest, shared conversations, rather than whoever has the highest innate skill just kind of bears the brunt of everybody else's stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's at the core, honestly, is really being able to have the emotional, psychological capacity to deal with the world that we're in now. Like, I think that has always been the case, but now there's just, I think, an urgency to it, because if we do nothing, it's just not looking great.
It's not looking great for 98% of us. That other 2% might be okay.
Yeah.
Depending on how we define okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So if you are comfortable, and you can answer this to the degree of personal that you're comfortable with, can you share an example from your own life where you learned something valuable through failure?
This is probably going to sound so bad. I have not experienced a whole lot of failure in my life. Again, because I felt like I had to be excellent, right? And so I learned. I was smart enough to be successful at school, even though I didn't know the language, and I learned it. And also the fact that we came to the United States when I was 5 and not 13, that improves language acquisition, right? All of those things. So yeah, so there's a part of it where, in terms of as a child, like, what could I be unsuccessful at? I was generally successful, but it was something I think that was indoctrinated, right? Of like, you need to do well so that you can be successful and not face all these consequences. Well, maybe this is also part of it, right? Because if we go with the way that we've been talking about failure and the systemic aspect of that, I mean, I did start to experience failure probably even when I was like in elementary school, when there was this state test that students had to take, and I was excluded because they're like, oh, well, you're not a native English speaker, and so you might, like, your test score might not really matter, is sort of what I got. And
is that it doesn't matter for you, or we don't want this skewing our numbers as a state?
I have no idea. I just know that I was excluded. I
Okay.
really can't say which way they were going, but probably, right? But it was interesting because then later they were like, you know what, actually, we think you can take the test. And I was happy. I was so happy to take the test. to be a part of, and so there's stuff like that throughout my life. When I when it was high school and during high school, and there were programs, college preparedness programs. And like I said, I had good grades, all of that. And they were looking at minoritized students, and they're like, hey, I got a letter saying, hey, we're offering this program, whatever, to get funding for college. And I was denied because I didn't have a social security number. And so even though we recognize, again, that it's systemic and we can say it was oppressive systems, the experience felt like personal failure. It felt like there was something wrong with me. I think in terms of like the overcoming it, like what happened, I think what happened was just that I was like, I don't know what else I can do. Like, I will pursue my education as much as I can. That's sort of one, that was something that was very much indoctrinated. Again, like, get your education. Like, this is very common. Like, it will make my parents' sacrifice matter or mean something. Even though for them, had I just graduated high school, it would have been fine. But for me, it was like, I had the sense that I could do more. I had the sense that I could accomplish, in terms of like, can I be a psychologist? Yes, like I had that sense. I just didn't know whether I had the resources to do it. And so I think it was more of like, well, let me just try, and see how far I can go. And then when I started to experience, I guess, more academic failure per se, was in grad school, because that was a completely different experience from any other experience that I had, where I think pretty much no one I knew, no one in my close circle or like people that I knew had ever gone to graduate school. And there's different expectations, there's different things that people assume that you know just because you're there. And I knew none of it. So that was a whole other thing. And what ended up happening in that experience was that I ended up realizing that there were things that I knew about how the world worked that my peers didn't. And I was like, this is odd, right? Because I thought that they knew more than I did, because that's what has been told and the expectations and the feedback I get, right? But in practice, I actually had a better sense of how the world works and where people were coming from. And so that sort of sustained me, I guess. It helped me to build confidence in myself and the work that I was doing. And so that's sort of, I think, what ended up happening there.
It sounds like you were able to kind of get some perspective on these metrics may not be the only metrics of what is successful and valuable to practice in this field.
Yeah. And I was still held to those metrics, and I still, I barely made it through my dissertation. It's not something that I'm like, wow, this was amazing. Which I think just about everybody says, but like, no, seriously. Yeah, it was recognizing that I still had to perform based on their metrics and meet them, while also identifying what my own metrics were.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to acknowledge for our listeners, this was all happening the same time you were taking your case to the Supreme Court.
That was, yeah. So I started grad school 2015, graduated 2021. And in 2017, I became a plaintiff against the Trump administration for illegally rescinding DACA. That lasted basically from 2017 on to the end of my grad experience. So, yeah.
Yeah. So when we think about kind of intersectionality, things that maybe we don't know other people are dealing with, being undocumented, having this legal thing alongside what is already a very grueling program, and also not being able to just access financial aid the way other students do. Mm-hmm. So having to find funding and access to funding when you are undocumented is a much higher challenge than for your peers who are documented.
Well, honestly, financial access is the primary reason why people do not pursue grad school, because it's not there. And so, yeah, I think now that you brought it up, like, part of what happened is that I realized, I was like, hey, no one else is suing the government. And so I think, the fact that I'm still here, I'm doing this, yeah, I could say probably my academic work wasn't like the best that it could be, but I'm still making it, and like I'm graduating on time. And people went through things, right? Like people had family emergencies, health problems, those kinds of things. The thing, though, that I realized was like, I could experience any of those things. I could experience health problems. I could experience a family member emergency, all of those things. But my peers won't ever know what it's like to be undocumented.
Yeah.
And so that changed things for me.
Your path is very much different.
Yeah. And so there was a moment where I was like, you know what? I can't keep striving for validation or acceptance that has no intention of coming my way.
Mm. And I think that's where I'm going back to that image you had of the charts of like all good things and the bad things, mm-hmm. and they're not correlated. Mm-hmm. And I hear you sort of anchoring into the good side of things of like, this is what defines my life and this is what I'm about. And the other stuff will happen regardless. So let's put my energy into the things that make life more beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, this whole experience, being undocumented, adding onto it the grad school experience in psychology of all things, I guess I already had a leaning towards being introspective and existential. But it did make me question a lot of like, why am I here? Like, what's the point of all of this? And I went through different phases of like, okay, maybe it's like to help people, which is, it's noble, sure. But then I was like, that still doesn't quite make sense. And what I've landed on is that I think we're here to enjoy the beauty that is around us. And that's like, I literally could just go outside and like, or not even, I can like look at my plant right here, right? Recognize that, hey, a good friend gave that to me, that the plant is like beautiful. Like there's all these things about it, right? Like inherently that plant is beautiful, whether I think about it or not. And it's not associated to capitalism. It's not associated to all these value judgments and metrics of worthiness that we have about things. Like it just is, and it's beautiful. So that's one way, right? And then expanding that to while I was in grad school, I had so much support from people in the wider community that were associated of being like the hardest groups for undocumented people, which were white evangelical Christians. And they were the ones helping me the most. And so the beauty of turning upside down these expectations, and that these two groups of people cannot relate, cannot see each other, cannot build relationship, that to me was beautiful. And so
it's incredible.
Yeah. So my definition of beauty is pretty broad. And I think that's what we're here for. And it can look in a variety of different ways. We are unfortunately still part of the system. But yeah, that's where I landed.
That's beautiful. I really appreciate your openness and kind of stepping into heavy topics, but modeling for all of us how to hold the heaviness amidst the beauty, and those exist together at the same time always. Mm-hmm. So if people are interested either in working with you as a clinician from California or Nevada, or wanting to hire you for trainings or events, etc., how can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, the best way to do so is through my website. It is allgoodthingsps.com, and there's a form to fill out to contact me, and I'm pretty good at responding. And if you want to follow on social media, I do have an Instagram page, at allgoodthingspsychology.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me today, for sharing your knowledge, your expertise, and giving us a glimpse into what grad school was like for someone who is undocumented. I know we scratched the surface of something very complex and deep. And thank you to everyone who listened. Remember that failure is a necessary part of growth, so keep failing, keep learning, and keep growing. Special thank you to everyone who contributed to this project. Consulting producer and editor, July Diaz. Producer and graphic designer, Ben Castle. Logo art by Josie Huang. Theme music by Daniel Rogers.